Welcome to Go Green Radio, everybody. So glad that you could join us today. I am so excited to bring on our next guest. This is the first time that we've had them on our radio show. Nalamalapu is the author of a new graphic memoir called Holler. And I like a graphic novel as much as anyone else, but this one hit so hard. It's so good and it's brand new. And I really hope that our listeners will get out on your favorite place to buy a book. You can get it on Amazon and a lot of other places, but it's called Holler, Holler. And we're going to be talking with Denali and their whole process for going through the process of writing this, the interviews that they took to really inspire the audience for Holler. So, Denali, welcome to Go Green Radio. I am so excited to have you on.
Thanks for having me, Jill. I'm so excited to be on the show.
Well, let's start at the beginning. Talk to us about why Appalachia has become a front line in the climate justice movement.
So, about a century ago, Appalachia was identified and targeted with immense fossil fuel extraction because of the rich resource abundance in the region. And that included extraction of coal through processes like mountaintop removal, and also more recently has included fracking and natural gas or fracked gas pipelines. And largely because the region has been targeted so heavily by the fossil fuel industry, there has also been a spotlight and an abundance of resistance to fossil fuel projects. And we know that fossil fuel projects are the highest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions, which is why we have the climate crisis. And so, because people are so seasoned here with resisting these projects, surviving alongside these projects, and ending these projects, the climate movement has learned from and will continue to learn from that history and the people on the ground here who continue to resist newer projects like the Mountain Valley Pipeline.
Interesting. Honestly, I've covered mountaintop removal on Go Green Radio before, and so we've talked about that, but I didn't realize that the history was so long for a century. That's fascinating. So, in your mind, Denali, are you thinking that the public agencies that the folks in Appalachia are fighting against, um, and appealing to for relief, are they supporting industry at the expense of community health?
It's an interesting question, and a lot of it has shifted since November of last year. Largely, what I hear from folks on the ground in Appalachia from this century spent resisting and living alongside fossil fuel projects is that there is a lack of prioritizing and listening to the voices of community members on the ground, and an over common an exceedingly common propensity to side with industry. So I wouldn't say like decisively these regulatory agencies are on one side over the other, but
Hmm.
something I continuously hear from people who have spent their lives advocating for community health and planetary health, um, and against these projects is that they see the regulatory agencies and politicians are often bought out by industry and are
Hmm.
often not incentivized to, and also the processes don't reflect prioritization of the importance of community voices. So there are even people who are involved in resistance to these projects that aren't totally against the fossil fuel industry, but
Hmm.
are very strongly aware of that dynamic, that the people who are most impacted, who end up getting sick, who end up dying, for example, listeners probably have heard of black lung disease, which is
Hmm.
a really terrible form of cancer that impacts coal miners, and people are very used to such terrible impacts not being paid attention to by a government that claims that it is working for the people.
Well, it's interesting you bring up black lung disease. My father was a career coal miner. He's retired now, but that was one of the biggest fears. I mean, there are a lot of things to be afraid of when you're 800 feet under the ground, cave-ins and all these things. But black lung disease was something that, was a big fear for everyone involved. What inspired you personally to document the fight against the Mountain Valley Pipeline through a graphic memoir format? And how did that medium shape your message, Denali?
I remember the moment I conceived of this project was when I'd already started working in the pipeline fight. I'm a career climate activist, so I had been doing national climate advocacy and I shifted to supporting the movement to stop the Mountain Valley Pipeline. And a group of pipeline fighters and I were getting some rest on the coast of North Carolina. And I was thinking about what are the ways that we haven't communicated the impact of this project to people and who are the audiences we're missing. And what came to mind for me was young readers, elderly readers, and readers who are so busy with their day-to-day life and like struggling to take care of X number of kids and juggle X number of jobs, all these things, and can't necessarily read the latest 300-page Al Gore manifesto on climate change, but are interested in learning about the impact of these projects on land and how everyday people are involved in resistance. And I have always been very into drawing and writing. That's something that I've loved since a very young age. And I started in comics. I remember my mom gave me a secondhand how to draw cartoon faces. And so I spent my childhood really into comics and then diverged a bit and then but I still had that skill set. So when I thought about those readers and what modes of communication could appeal to them, graphic novels came to mind. And I wanted to work on a project that made sense for my skills. And I could bring to the project that writing background and the experience in cartoons and comics. So it was like both strategic in terms of who are we missing and who wants to hear these stories that isn't able to access them, and also what skills do I have and how can I use them as part of the project.
I love that. Now, in your graphic novel, Holler, we meet six different activists, and they're from very different walks of life. How did you choose whose stories to include and what unites them?
There were three buckets that were important to me. One, the 303-mile fracked gas pipeline, the Mountain Valley Pipeline, goes all the way through West Virginia from north to south, and then through Southwest Virginia, which is the part of the pipeline is like near Virginia Tech, west of Roanoke for people that are a little familiar with Virginia geography, and then stops near northern North Carolina. But historically, in part because of suppression of the right to protest and right to free speech in West Virginia, the Virginia part of the pipeline has gotten a lot more coverage. And I wanted to balance the West Virginia pipeline fighters and the Virginia pipeline fighters. It would have been a little too easy to focus on the Virginia side, especially since I live in Southwest Virginia. But the
Hmm.
first bucket that was important to me was that West Virginian voices were also in the book. The second bucket was the intergenerational nature of the fight. I think
Hmm.
oftentimes protesting is talked about as a young person's game. It's like you get really into protesting when you're in college and you're kind of grungy. You don't feel like you have to shower all the time. You can sleep in the woods. And then you you become more realistic about life and you go down the well-trodden path of marriage and family and you forget about it. But the reality of this pipeline fight was that it was very intergenerational. There were people from children who grew up in the movement, like Michael James Duramo, who's profiled in chapter 5 of the book, to 80-year-olds who were already well into their elderhood who learned about the pipeline coming through their land, like Paula Mann and Carolyn Givens, and also parents, people in their middle age, single mothers like Crystal Mello. And so I wanted to portray that intergenerational element. And then lastly, as a person of color in the Appalachian region, I find that there's often a misrepresentation of the region as entirely white and
Hmm.
elderly and voting a certain way. But my experience is that there is diversity in the region. Of course, it's not New York City. You don't see like
Hmm.
every type of person everywhere. But for example, the final chapter of the book profiles a seed keeper who's of the Monacan Nation, which is the land that I wrote this entire project on. And then Crystal Mello in the center of the book is from a mixed race family. And I wanted those conversations and perspectives to be part of the book. And then what ties them all together is really that they're all ordinary people who heard about this pipeline either coming through their land or their community, and then they used the skills that they already had to fight the pipeline. They weren't career activists who
Hmm.
moved to Appalachia to fight the pipeline. They were people here who decided to take a stand.
It was interesting. I mean, we could talk about each and every one of them, and their stories are fascinating, and that's why I loved reading Holler. But Carolyn Givens, you placed this in the book, and I thought this was mind-blowing. But she told you what she found out would happen to people if they are in the blast zone, if the pipeline exploded. And I want you to share that with us so that our listeners understand why there's such a sense of urgency around this.
So there's a scene in the book where Carolyn's discovering, as you said, Jill, what the dangers of the pipeline is. And she says in the book, I quickly discovered the dangers of the pipeline, including what would happen if the pipeline exploded. If you're in the blast zone near the pipeline, you're vaporized. Nothing is left of you but gas. If you're in the evacuation zone a few miles away from the pipeline, and you don't get out, you'll be badly burned. So, in that section of the book, she highlights explicitly what could happen to a person's body if they were near the pipeline and it exploded. And this is particularly relevant to people on the pipeline route because the company, one of the main companies behind the pipeline, has been responsible for fracked gas explosions and leaks that have gone so far as to injure an entire family, including their 4-year-old. So it's a very vivid and real fear for people like Carolyn. Carolyn.
Mm-hmm. And I really appreciate you making that so clear because I think it's important for folks to understand we're not just talking about a nuisance, an eyesore. We're talking about a horrendous form of injury and death. Thank you so much for that. We're going to take a quick commercial break, but we've got so much more to talk about with Denali. So don't go away, folks. There's more Go Green Radio right after this. Welcome back to Go Green Radio. Thank you so much for tuning in. We have a great guest today, Nalamalapu, and I'm sorry about that. Wow, there's my tongue getting twisted up. Nalamalapu has written a graphic novel that is amazing. It's called Holler, Holler. You can get it anywhere you buy books, including Amazon, and I really encourage you to do so. This book is the result of interviewing six folks who live in Appalachia who are fighting the Mountain Valley Pipeline, and it is fascinating and well done. Denali, what did you learn from these six people specifically about how to fight seemingly overwhelming odds and still maintain joy and lead with love, even while you fight with all of your being? What did you learn from these folks?
The biggest thing I learned, which might sound a little cliche, but I think always bears repeating, is the power of community. Because the reality of the Mountain Valley Pipeline is that unfortunately, because of an unprecedented move on the congressional stage, peddled by Senator Joe Manchin, the pipeline was completed despite 10 years of resistance, many lawsuits, many denied permits. And so this isn't a story of 100% the community won, everything's hopeful, the world is better. It's much more complicated than that. And I think that's why it's an important story to tell because our reality with the climate crisis is that we're not going to totally solve everything and restore the Amazon to what it once was, but it's likely going to look somewhere in the gray area between fossil fuels running rampant and restoration of complete restoration of biodiversity. And so having that repeated to me by these resistors who were directly impacted by the pipeline, that the community is what held them through, that the friends they made is what made them continue to fight and what keeps them alive today, I think is a really amazing lesson that I learned and that readers can learn from this book. For example, there are romantic couples that met through this pipeline fight. There are best friends who met through this pipeline fight. There are kids who grew up together and spent their formative years shaped by the resistors and by each other. And that aspect of even if you don't win against insurmountable odds, the fight is still worth it because of the people you meet and the other people around the world that you inspire is was a really important takeaway for me from working on this book and also fighting the pipeline alongside the people in the book.
That's so important. I mean, we can use words like community, but it's human beings. We have to shore each other up and support each other because otherwise, sometimes these fights gets so difficult. It's very easy to feel isolated. And I think that what you just said is a mouthful, especially for our younger folks who are getting into this for the first time, not to forget to surround yourself with other human beings that can lift you up and keep you going when it gets hard, and it will get hard. That was a great reflection, Denali. I have to ask, what does the word holler mean to you? And why did you choose that as the title for your book?
I'm the type of creator that really likes a project title. I admire creators who can like write a whole book and not title it, but I'm not one of them. I like how it can give me a sense of focus and really express the theme of the project. So I thought of the title pretty early on. I was driving through the mountains to each of these six people's homes and towns. And I was thinking of how in Appalachia we call very rural neighborhoods hollers because they're tucked away in
Mm,
the hollows of the mountain. And also, as you just said, Jill, a key part of the fight was that connection between people, that reality that they could holler over the mountain to each
Mhm.
other, whether they were in their 80s and not as mobile as they used to be, and they were like literally hollering through the phone, or there were people who were hollering over the mountainside from stream to stream about how the pipeline construction was impacting their local waterways. And so I found joy in that double meaning, and it's been
Mhm.
fun to see people resonate with different parts of it now that the book's out.
Yeah, I think it's a cool title, and it's very memorable for one thing. But I often hear that word in terms of like, hey, I'm gonna holler at you, or I'll holler at you later, something like that, and it just there is a lot of meaning to that word and familiarity that I thought was really cool title. Um, I've been doing this show. We're now in our 18th season, and I have read a lot of books from a lot of authors that I've had on the show. But honestly, Denali, this is the first time that I've seen a graphic novel on this subject, any subject having to do with climate justice. And I'm sure there are others out there. In fact, I'll give an open invitation to anybody who's got one to let me know and come on the show. But this book was really such a powerful fusion of art and activism. How do you see like visual storytelling contributing to the environmental justice movement?
I think you're right, Jill. I mean, I spent 3 years writing this book and I looked everywhere for other climate justice graphic novels, and there are a handful, but there aren't a lot. Particularly, there aren't many that take place in the US, the country where
Hmm.
we live. And so that felt important too, to be able to offer something to the canon. There are definitely so many different diverse ways people are communicating about climate change. And the thing about comics that really speaks to me as a mode of communicating about climate justice is how emotive it is, and
Hmm.
how readers of different ages and reading abilities can get many different things from comics. You can be someone that reads every single word, but maybe skims
Hmm.
by the pictures. You can be someone who's not as strong of a reader and you skim by the pictures. You can be someone who's obsessed with comics and you're reading everything and looking at every detail. And the medium has something to offer to all of those readers. I'm someone, I love a book of words, but I don't read every single 500-page book about climate change because I think about climate change all the time, and it can be a little overwhelming to be that saturated by someone's thoughts on the
Hmm.
topic, even though there are many, many brilliant books out there. And I'm really interested in offering to the canon more accessible, like engaging, colorful versions of these stories from the ground, because I think we're missing some people when we're the majority of our books are like fairly morose, in black and white, and
Hmm.
very long.
You're so right. You're so right. This was a real void, and you're beginning to fill it. And I'm gonna encourage you to keep doing it because Holler is so good. Lately we've seen a lot of discussion around the folks who live in Appalachia, and they're often misunderstood and stereotyped. This is, it's risen to the level of national conversation in the last few months. How does your book, Holler, challenge those narratives?
Yeah, this is something I think about a lot as someone who lives in the region, and I read a lot of Appalachian literature, more fiction than nonfiction, but I also love nonfiction and poetry coming out of the region. And I do think, from my perspective as a climate organizer, we miss out a lot when we write off this region, in part because of what we started with, Jill, which is the century-long history of
Hmm.
extraction and resistance to extraction in the region. And so when especially people in coastal cities, cast off this region as a bunch of white people who are live rurally and vote
Hmm.
against their interests. We miss out on the rich history of resistance. We miss out on these mountain communities who are so connected to this very biodiverse land and know the land and know very intricately how these projects impact the land and how these industries work and how they dig their claws into the communities, all of these different things we miss out on. And so it feels important to me, the sort of one of the macro concepts of this book is contributing alongside many, many writers a more nuanced version of Appalachia. There's a writer named Nima Vashia, who's one of the only other queer Indian Appalachian writers that I know of. And Nima's book, Another Appalachia, was a book that I read before starting this project, and I think has had some really beautiful, like consistent waves of resonating with people, largely because it's an antidote to that kind of like oversimplified version of Appalachia that we see on the national stage and that we hear about oftentimes from outsiders, sometimes from very prolific, known
Hmm.
people on the federal stage. But I think in part because I come from a country that because I come from India and I know about what colonization and extraction does to the voices of people on the ground, it's important to
Hmm.
me to be telling these stories in the place that I live and from a community that I care about.
Well said. I love that. Well, the Mountain Valley pipeline fight continues. It's ongoing. What role do you hope your book Holler plays in that resistance or in broader climate movements?
I have the more macro hope of I hope that readers around the country and maybe even in other parts of the world pick up the book and are able to learn some of the lessons that we encountered in our decade-long fight against this pipeline and are able to take from these six individuals inspiration for their own life to use the skills that they have to protect the land that they love. So I have that sort of like national and global hope. And then I have the more movement hope of contributing another version of pipeline struggle of climate justice fights to the conversations in the movement and the stories we're telling in the movement because I think that some of the lessons we learned from this pipeline, including that everyday people know a lot about the land and waters around them, are important for our climate fight as we try and get as many people as we can to join us. And then lastly, I do hope that the book resonates with people who live in the region and heard about the Mountain Valley Pipeline or were part of the fight, and that they can see both their grief reflected, but also the magic that came of the fight by in encountering the book.
I love it. I love it. I have a feeling people will be reading Holler all over the place, but definitely in Appalachia for a very long time because you've been really, really authentic in the way that you have portrayed these folks and their real life struggle. I love it. We're going to take a quick commercial break, but we have so much more to talk about with Denali, so don't go away, folks. There's more Go Green Radio right after this. Welcome back to Go Green Radio. We're having a blast today talking with Denali, who has just written a book that I highly recommend. It's a graphic novel about a very specific climate justice situation that's going on in Appalachia, the Mountain Valley Pipeline. Denali interviewed six people in different parts of the area, in different walks of life, and captured those interviews beautifully in their new book, Holler, Holler, Holler. You can get it on Amazon or anywhere you like to buy books and graphic novels, and I highly recommend. Denali, the characters in Holler are so captivating and they're so deeply connected to place. How does the Appalachian landscape function as more than just a backdrop for their story?
The mountains of Appalachia are really, for many people living here, including myself, like a family member or a character in our lives and our reason for living here. And I dedicated this book to our mountains and the people that protect them. I just took a trip to Atlanta and I was driving up north. And the minute I hit the mountains, I just felt at home. And I know this is something that is very true for many, many people across Appalachia. It's like we are just welcomed into their embrace, whether we like it or not. They're so ancient and captivating and diverse and green. And the Mountain Valley Pipeline was not only named after these mountains, but also endangered them. And the many of the reasons why we fought the pipeline had to do with protecting these mountains. The Mountain Valley Pipeline was planned for the very flat lands of the Midwest, but then the plans were rerouted to the very steep slopes of Appalachia, where there are near vertical slopes on the pipeline route that also are on very landslide prone land. I did a book talk in West Virginia recently, and one of the women that came to the book talk said she passed five landslides on her way from her cabin to the bookstore.
Wow.
And additionally, the Mountain Valley Pipeline goes through a seismic zone. So there are earthquakes that occur yearly on the path. And so when you think about a high pressure, massive fracked gas pipeline pumping this gas through sometimes 90-degree slopes where landslides occur quite regularly, through communities who could be extinguished by an explosion, you really begin to understand why people spent 10 years of their lives fighting against this very poorly planned project, especially given that very few of the project planners had ever stepped foot on the mountains. And so that both that beauty and that connection of the mountains and that fierce need to protect them and to survive are huge parts of the book.
Hmm. I'm going to shift gears a little bit because, you are a career climate activist, and you've seen lots of different components of the movement. And it seems like a lot of times we see climate activists flocking to big city protests. I mean, if I had a nickel for every huge turnout I've seen in DC or New York, even San Francisco or LA, I'd be rich. We we don't always see those kinds of crowds on the front lines of a fight like what you've seen, in Appalachia, where it's kind of sparsely populated when it comes to the numbers around the fight. Are What's up with that? I mean, and do you think that activists are missing out on opportunities to really make a difference by not showing up in large numbers in these locations?
I would start my response to that question with the fossil fuel industry targets these very rural, disenfranchised, under-resourced communities because they know that they are harder places to organize people because as you said, people in Appalachia, especially West Virginia, live pretty far apart. Many people are elderly. There's a lot of poverty in Southwest Virginia and in West Virginia. And so these fossil fuel companies like to push their projects through this land because if they don't, they often lose. We saw the
Hmm.
Atlantic Coast Pipeline proposed at the same time the Mountain Valley Pipeline was proposed. The Atlantic Coast Pipeline went through Charlottesville, which listeners will have heard of the University of
Hmm.
Virginia, and maybe what will come to mind is wealth. There's a lot of wealth in
Hmm.
Charlottesville, and people who owned vineyards along the route were very angry about the idea of a pipeline coming through this beautiful land. Whereas in the Mountain Valley Pipeline's route, there were many, many, many fewer people of that access to power and resources. And so I think primarily the people that I put the onus on for why the landscape of the movement looks this way is the fossil fuel industry. And then secondarily, I'm someone that grew up in southern India and southern Maine. So I'm very used to um, coastal cities undervaluing the wisdom, the verve, the beauty of the places that I call home. I remember as a kid traveling to Washington, D.C. for a workshop, and one of the other kids in that like political conference asked me if I had electricity in Maine, which was very surprising to me because Portland, Maine is quite the bustling little city, but them, it was like I lived in the most northern stretches of Canada almost. And so I'm very used to sort of having that connection to places that are undervalued by people who, for no fault of their own, may have spent their entire lives in a city and not come out to the parts of the world that I call home. And so I have a passion for rural places, for the resistance and passion of people that live in rural places, their connection to the land. And so I'm kind of predisposed to see that nuance. I also do think there's an element that the movement needs to do some introspecting on, which is that massive protests are vital parts of our work and our history. And also, there are important moments of resistance and movements that happen in rural spaces that really aren't that far from bustling
Hmm.
cities. Like the Mountain Valley Pipeline route is 3 to 5 hours, depending on where you're going from Washington, D.C. But in part because of the sort of myopia that is quite common in cities where it feels like your entire world is the city. Many people haven't even heard of the Mountain Valley Pipeline now, even after
Hmm.
President Biden signed it through to completion. And so I do think there's important introspecting for urban elites and for city dwellers to do as to why it seems so beyond their imagination to drive 3 hours outside of their city to support people who are protecting the resources that give them life. Like Appalachia
Hmm.
is one of the biggest reasons why the United States, for better or for worse, is such a global player and
Yep.
is like so well resourced. So I do
Hmm.
hope that part of this book is contributing to the importance of rural voices and of people in urban spaces paying attention to and investing in the struggles and victories here.
Well said. And I'll say this just from my own perspective, because I'm not going to put words in your mouth at all. You speak well for your perspective, but from my perspective, a lot of climate activists are quick to point out how everybody else needs to improve, and that should include ourselves. We need to work on ourselves. That's part of the humility of being effective in what we do, is to continuously work on how we can improve ourselves, our movement, and be as inclusive as possible. And there are some folks in the movement that, have a real difficult time with that kind of a message. But I think if we're going to be authentic and we're going to be the best that we possibly can be, we need to challenge ourselves about where we are encountering our fellow human beings in this fight. So thank you for that perspective, Denali.
I think
Um,
also
go ahead.
I wouldn't have written this book if I wasn't constantly challenging myself
Yep.
to be humble and to listen to people who don't look like me. So I
Mm-hmm.
do know from personal experience that your life and your contribution to the fight for climate justice will be better if you constantly challenge yourself to be humble and look at what your mindset is, what your actions are, learn from others, rethink, like all of
Mm-hmm.
all of what you said, Jill, is something that's important to me, and I know from experience it's made my journey better.
Mm-hmm. I can see that. It's so clear in your work, Denali, that you have that ferve, to improve and to learn and to encounter people where they are. And I hope that, as that comes across in your book, Holler, it will inspire others to go there, to be there, with our fellow human beings on the front lines. I loved the thread of intergenerational learning and legacy that you express in Holler. Um, how do you see climate activism being passed down and transformed across generations?
I grew up with a mother who loved her elders. I remember from infancy, my best friends were the 80-year-olds and 70-year-olds that lived with me. And so I was raised with a respect for and also I'm very used to building relationships with people who are many years elder to me that are sort of balanced in terms of respect and listening. And I think that's like really carried through my life, and later in life is when I developed that appreciation for kids because I was a kid, so I wasn't like that excited about kids, but I learned how much like young people bring to my life and remind me of what matters. And it's so exciting to me that this book turned out in such an intergenerational way because I really do want people to, as you just said, Jill, to take receive each other where we are at, whether that's working with our elders to learn more about the momentum in gender equality and gender identity that's taken place since they were young, or it's like learning from our elders about other movements. Oftentimes, what I'm learning from my elders is about appreciation for the land and about their role in other movements that took place before I was born. Like I learn a lot from the Black liberation movement and the
Hmm.
civil rights fight. And I can't understate for people that are interested in being organizers, being part of the climate movement in like sort of like thoughtful ways, learning from those movements globally and
Hmm.
in the US is so important, and what better way to learn it from people who are still around who
Hmm.
witnessed those moments.
Absolutely. I mean, all you have to do, I'll pick one, because all of those movements have such incredible lessons learned. But I mean, if you look for at the fight for gender equality, we still don't have the Equal Rights Amendment. And that's been a fight that's been ongoing since when I was a baby, and I'm not young. And yet, we still fight, and yet we still rise and keep working on it. But for a lot of young folks, I think it's important to remember that your fight may or may not be culminated in your lifetime, but you contribute to the movement the best that you can, eh, with both a sense of urgency and the wisdom and patience to know that it may take a very long time to see with your own eyes what you're fighting for when you're young. And on that, sorry, we got to take a quick commercial break, but we have a lot more to talk about. So don't go away, folks. There's more Go Green Radio right after this. Welcome back to Go Green Radio. We are having such a great conversation. I am so thrilled to be joined by the author of a brand new graphic novel on the climate justice movement, specifically the Mountain Valley Project in Appalachia. And the book is called Holler, Holler. Check it out. I was so deeply moved, and I've read all kinds of stuff. You guys know, if you've been listening to me for a while, I read a little bit of everything when it comes to the sustainability movement, the climate change, activist movement. But this really grabbed me, and I hope that you will check it out. Denali, we have a whole bunch of young people who listen to Go Green Radio, and they want to find a job that will allow them to pay their bills. That is important. But they also want to be part of creating a more just and sustainable world. Um, I would love for you to give them some advice based on your own experience.
I've been working in the climate movement since I graduated college, basically. And what my path was to feel clearly in many moments that I wanted to do environmental work and then kind of let the rest happen however it happened. There have definitely been moments where I've been like, should I still keep doing climate work? I'm not sure. I think those moments of reflection are very natural for people, but largely I felt very clear that environmental work is my life's course. And so what has been useful to me is meeting people, whether online or in person, who are doing environmental work, hearing about their stories, about how they come in to the work, and then really getting clear on my own origin story. What strengths do I have that I'm contributing? So for me, I'm a pretty introverted person. And so I'm not the kind of person that wants to like be in the front of the protest with a megaphone singing
Mhm.
protest songs. So
Mhm.
what I did was find a path in communications where I'm definitely using my relational skills. I'm talking to people about what they're interested in, about what messages we want to share with our audience in terms of the climate movement and people who are interested in joining. But I'm also doing a lot of like more quiet work, like writing articles, posting on social media, editing videos, things like that. And so that's been my corner of the movement. But I would also say, I hope that young people um, find ways to do work that's meaningful to them and know that there are many ways in your life that you can join the climate movement. It doesn't necessarily have to be your full day job. For example, I have friends who are teachers and they're not teaching necessarily environmental studies or climate change studies, but they are incorporating this connection to the environment in their work with their students. They are trying to decarbonize their homes. They are part of mutual aid networks to help their neighbors and to receive help from their neighbors. So I think it helps to be kind of clear on, do you want this to be the center of your work the way I've gone about it? Or do you want to have a bit of a more like generalized approach to like my love is teaching and I can embed that passion for the environment and protecting this place that I call home into my life, even if my day job doesn't have climate change in the title.
And I think Holler really did a great job of showing that people can use whatever they are good at, being a photographer, being a writer, being someone who can research. They can use what they're already good at, natural strengths, to be an effective part of the movement. And I think that's really important for us to kind of underscore because sometimes when we look at the folks who become the face of the climate justice movement or the climate change activists, protests and things like that, we see some very similar skill sets. Like you said, people who are willing to get up and, give me the bullhorn, I've got this, and just, lead a group and chant. That's not most of us. And so it's really important, and your book does such a great job of underscoring this, that whatever your natural strengths are can be applied to this movement. And it's going to be an important part of the movement because you're playing to your strengths. And I don't know if you meant that to be on purpose, but you really did highlight that in a beautiful way in the book.
Yeah, I definitely feel like that sums up my approach to climate activism. It's like this Venn diagram between, okay, you know you're passionate about the environment and you want to take action on climate change, and you have gone through your life figuring out what you're good at and what you enjoy doing. For me, it's writing and art. And then there's a path in the middle there for you, whether it's that you become a climate communicator like I am, or it's something like, for example, for Becky Crabtree, who's in the book, is a science teacher. It's something that she embeds in her work as a science teacher to build that connection in her students between the land and themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And you were really candid in the book as well that sometimes there's grief and despair and even depression that can overcome activists of all walks of life. And I'm curious if you don't mind sharing what keeps you going, what gives you hope in the face of such long odds that we're all facing.
Yeah, I talk about in the book what it was like to witness the defeat of our pipeline fight occur through such a fluke. Like we were
Mhm.
really winning over those 10 years of exposing the injustices and wrongs of the pipeline and getting leaders to listen. And the grief definitely took some time to set in because I think as organizers, we're used to constantly being busy and don't always make time or have the time to sit with what's happening around us. But I'm someone that has grappled with chronic depression my whole life. So I know that I'll go through the ups and downs in life, no matter if I'm like losing a huge pipeline fight or not. And so I'm very in touch with what helps me in those moments. And for me, it's having a strong network of friends who, not all of my friends are climate organizers. Actually, very few of them are. A lot of my friends are people that share my values. And so when I experience bouts of grief and despair, there are people I can go to and share that experience with, and they're not going to say, oh, it'll all get better. They're going to like help me sit with those thoughts and consider them as real. And
Mhm.
then I also have a very regular practice of hiking and being by the water and walking in my neighborhood and all these things that help me slow down and be present with what I'm experiencing and also be present with the changes in nature. I live in a four-seasoned part of the country, and so being present for when bloodroot comes out of the leaves in the Appalachian forest, which is a native plant that's really beautiful and serene. And when the leaves are all dropping, and I know that we're in for months of stick season, like all of these things, all of these noticings help me slow down and remember why I'm doing this work in the first place.
Beautifully said. We've got about a minute left, Denali, which makes me so sad because I could talk to you all day. But in that final moment of our show, what parting thoughts would you like to leave with our listeners?
I would love for readers and listeners to take some time to see what comes up for you listening to this conversation around what you're passionate about, what you're good at, how you want to be involved in the movement, and hopefully be inspired by these stories of ordinary people who used the skills that they had to take action because we really do need everyone to help us in this fight for a livable future.
Well said. Thank you for that, Denali. Thank you for joining us today, and congratulations on your new book. To all of our listeners, thank you so much for joining us. Check out Denali's book, Holler, Holler, wherever you buy books. It's amazing. And to everybody, I'm going to be here same time, same place next week with more Go Green Radio. So until then, have a wonderful week and do something in your life to go green.